Alright, welcome to the second half of our lesson on the history of management principles. And today we're going to focus on the modern management approaches that have existed since about the last 50 years or so. The first one we're going to talk about is quantitative analysis that was developed by Robert McNamara and Tex Thornton. This theory is sometimes also referred to as the operations research or management science theory, and it was an approach that was a direct result of World War II. Robert McNamara and Tex Thornton were both colonels in the American Army, and they were responsible for the analysis of the Allied supply of resources. All of the actual combat supplies like bullets and bombs and all that kind of stuff, as well as troop deployments. And they were responsible for making sure that they had the correct amount of stuff in place in the correct locations to make sure that they would be successful in their battles. And when the war was over, they took these strategies and attempted to apply them to the business world when the entire department that was run under these two was hired as a whole by Ford. Because Ford at the time had just finished losing $60 million in 1946. And the interesting thing was they didn't have any of the paperwork or analysis there to even know that they'd lost that much money. They just knew they were in trouble. So they were hired to Ford in an effort to try and isolate or figure out what was going wrong and make the company profitable again. And they did this by trying to improve the way that they made decisions, the cost-benefit analysis, resource allocation, and so on. So the techniques that they used were all sorts of statistical analysis to figure out exactly what was going on. So things like mathematical forecasting, which is responsible for predicting future trends based on math models of what's going on currently and in the past. Using inventory analysis, which is where you try and control inventories based on supply and demand around you. Linear programming, where you're determining how to optimize the use of your resources. So for example, if I have a company that produces a whole bunch of different products that all come from the same resources and use the same machinery, I want to try and optimize that resource usage so I can get all those products as best as possible. Queuing theory, where we're trying to run or determine the best use of our workers to maintain both a minimum amount of wait time for my customers as well as a minimum cost in employing my workers. Networking models or network models, where I'm trying to figure out how to best divide the tasks that my company into smaller tasks so that I can timetable things better and I can get the best amount of completion as possible. And finally, they also use simulations or computerized scenarios to try and predict the results of certain situations based on a variety of different things. So these approaches are still used today when we're making planning and controlling decisions. And the more we move into the future, the more advanced software we have to make it even more and more predictive of what we think is going to happen. The trick here is that you still, no matter how advanced that software gets, you still have to have managers that are capable of interpreting the results and applying them to the company. The next type of approach we're going to talk about is called the systems approach. And the systems approach was developed around 1965 by a gentleman named Ludwig von, I'm not going to try that name. So it was based on the idea that an organization is a system of parts that are combined to make a unified whole. Think of it like a human body, right? The human body is a whole thing, but it has a system of parts, a whole bunch of systems that are responsible to make it work. So you've got your circulatory system, and you've got your reproductive system, and you've got your respiratory system, and so on. And each of those systems work in isolation, but they also work in conjunction with the other systems to make the overall whole work. Well, the idea here is that a business is the same way. It's a combination of all those individual systems within the company that work together in order to make the whole company work. And there are two types of systems that you can have. You can have a closed system, which means that it's not influenced by and does not interact with the environment outside. And you have an open system, which works and interacts effectively with the environment around it. The closed system was the way that typically before this approach came along, most companies were acting. So they were acting in a way that they just worried about what was going on within the company and ignored what was going on in the greater environment around them. Today, more and more companies tend to go towards the open system, where we're interacting with our suppliers and our customers and even other companies and working together to build products that work for both of us. There are still some companies that remain closed, particularly when the information of the products they're producing are they're really concerned with proprietary rights, or they're trying to be secretive of the information. So like the CIA, for example, where they don't want any information leaking out. In this case, in this situation, each company is made up of subsystems, as I said before, that work together to achieve the company goal. So you can see an example here where we have a bunch of inputs coming into our system, the circle being our overall company here, and that company is made up of a bunch of different systems that kind of overlap and work together, but each have their own distinct tasks and functions. And in this company, management must ensure to have proper communication between each subsystem to make sure that there's a cooperation across the company as a whole to increase its efficiency. It's important in today's business because it ensures that all subsystems are optimized to achieve maximum compatibility for optimum productivity. The next one we'll look at is the contingency approach, also developed around the same time, started by someone named Joan Woodward. This approach is sometimes also called the situational approach. It integrates all the theories that we've seen so far into a little bit more of a logical system. The idea here is that companies today are very diverse. There's a whole bunch of variety in the types of companies that we have. And as a result, because we have all these variety of companies and tasks and situations, there's not any one set of principles that we can have that will apply in every possible situation. So here what we try and do is we try and create a manager that can work based on a variety of variables. We have each situation is going to have its own way of dealing with it. So depending on what those variables are, you have one principle to work here, another one to work here, another one to work here, and so on. And we have to know all those different methods of doing things, and we apply the right one in the right situation. Knowledge management is a little bit more of a recent idea, and it came around in about 1990 by a combination of people. And this is the idea that organizations use information technology to develop, organize, and share knowledge to achieve performance success, sometimes called a learning organization. The idea here is that the future success of any particular company is based on its ability to be continuously building a knowledge base, continuously researching new ideas and things that are happening, and using that knowledge in a way that promotes or moves that company further. Okay. Some companies have developed a new executive position called the CKO, or Chief Knowledge Officer, and their entire role is dealing with this whole knowledge success idea. They need to manage all the intellectual assets of the company, things like intellectual property rights, or the knowledge and understanding of the workforce as a whole, and trying to make sure they have all the tools towards them to help learn. So they're going to be doing training, going off to conferences, and so on. The core ingredients of a learning organization are 5 things. Number 1, employees have new mental models. They set aside the old way of looking at things, and they're approaching it in a 21st century mindset, where the way we approach business is much more different, much more collaborative, much more open. We've got personal mastery, so all the employees here become much more self-aware. Okay, we've got systems thinking. So each person in the employee knows in the company knows how the organization works as a whole. Shared vision. So all the people in the company again all have a consensus. They all agree on a plan of action to get towards that goal. And finally, team learning. We want all these companies to work together in teams and groups. The last one we're going to look at is evidence-based management, which is the most recent one that we'll look at. And it's the idea that managers analyze high-performance organizations in order to determine best practices. So they look at what are the highest performing, best producing, highest achieving companies out there and see how are they doing what they're doing, what are the principles they are applying, and then apply them into your own company. And there are a number of traits that have been identified for what we consider to be a quote-unquote high-performance organization. The first trait is that the organization must be people-oriented. So the idea here is that the company respects diversity across their employees. They are trying to empower their employees to contribute more. They're team-oriented. So these companies tend to emphasize collaboration amongst their employees, and their teams are actually self-directed to go in their own direction and do their own work. Information-oriented. So they're going to use information and IT to link people and information together to make them more knowledge-based. Achievement oriented. So the most successful companies tend to focus on the needs of their customers and shareholders, making sure that they're doing what they need to do to satisfy those individuals. They're constantly looking to how to improve their product and service. And finally, learning oriented. So they create a culture that facilitates learning and innovation and positive change within the company. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is briefly what is some of the traits that good managers in the 21st century must have moving forward. The first one is that they need to be global strategists. You need to understand the interconnections of all the different nations and cultures around the world, the economies of all these areas, and be able to incorporate them into your overall business plan. Secondly, current managers need to be masters of technology. They need to be able to leverage the IT that's existing in order to be able to move it to the best advantage for your company. They need to be inspiring leaders and to be able to attract and motivate top-end employees. And finally, they need to be models of ethical behavior. More and more as social media gets out there, companies need to be very aware of their image and their brand. So the managers need to be able to set high ethical standards for others within the company to follow. That's it. That's all we've got time for today. We'll see you in class tomorrow where we can practice what we've learned.